Welcome to another episode of Video Store Rejects, a podcast where we discuss directors' filmographies and our favorite film franchises. I'm your host, Cody House, and today we have a very special guest, their first appearance on the show. It is Brandon Stanwyck. Welcome, Brandon. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course. I'm really looking forward to diving into this film today.
Yes, and the film we are discussing today is Guillermo Del Toro's third film. We are currently doing a podcast on two filmmakers right now. We are doing the whimsical world of Wes Anderson and the fantastical world of Guillermo Del Toro. And the film we're talking about today is The Devil's Backbone, his third feature film, and the film that Del Toro says saved his soul and is the reason he's still a filmmaker today is because he got to make this movie. Brandon, are you a fan of Guillermo Del Toro? And I'm going to guess this probably wasn't your first film of his you watched.
Yeah, I am a fan of him. I'm a really big fan of creature features and monsters and how they can relate to our own humanity and things like that. And he sort of makes that a forefront of a lot of his works. And you're right. Devil's Backbone was not my first introduction to him. I want to say it was either Mimic or Blade 2. It was one of those two probably. And then I went to see The Devil's Backbone after the release of Pan's Labyrinth because that was when I was sort of getting into like the Oscars and the big movies of the time. And I really liked Pan's Labyrinth, and I decided I wanted to check out more. And it led me back to The Devil's Backbone.
Yeah, I think the two films you mentioned were probably my first films I saw of him. I think I watched Mimic and didn't know it was a Guillermo del Toro movie because I didn't know who Guillermo del Toro was yet. But I remember his name being mentioned heavily with like Blade 2 in magazines and stuff because that's how long ago it was. Like using the internet to search movie news wasn't as freely available as it is now because that was still dial up days, or at least where I was living, it was dial up days still. And I remember reading in some magazines, I think it was Cinescape, that they were mentioning The Devil's Backbone, like that. And that's interesting to me because I looked up and that this film was pretty well received critically, but I don't remember it like being showcased like on Roger Ebert's show or something like that. I remember reading it from like genre magazines and stuff that were like promoting the movie and endorsing it more so.
Yeah, I remember the same thing. I grew up on horror movies and reading horror literature, and it would have been around this time that I was really coming into my own in the genre. And I don't recall ever hearing about this movie. Mimic was a big blockbuster mainstream movie. Blade 2 was Hellboy, and all that. But I don't remember Devil's Backbone ever really piercing, the pop culture moment of 2001. I think, the others ended up taking that place as the technically foreign film about ghosts. So The Devil's Backbone, though it was like critically well received and well regarded among, that sphere of cinephiles, it never really got its sort of pop culture moment back then.
No, and I think it probably did, as you mentioned, get a resurgence with Pan's Labyrinth coming out because they have similar vibes, and Del Toro says they're like siblings to each other. He says the Devil's Backbone is more the masculine brother of Pan's Labyrinth.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true. I mean, Pan's Labyrinth was sort of my gateway to Devil's Backbone. It was because I liked that movie so much that I decided to go back and check that one out. And they do have their similarities. They take place relatively close in time, dealing with domestic warfare going on in Spain. The Devil's Backbone, I think, Pan's Labyrinth is a little more fantastical and fable like, whereas Devil's Backbone's a little more gothic. But you can definitely see how they are kindred spirits and probably came from a very similar place in Del Toro's mind.
For sure. What I think's interesting about this movie is that Del Toro insisted that he make this before because he had an offer already to direct Blade 2. And I don't know if you know the experience he shared on making Mimic, but it was quite nightmarish for him. And he almost considered not making movies afterwards because of how bad it was.
Yeah,
And
I've read
he's
it was a pretty bad experience.
Yeah, it was really rough and it's kind of strange. He quotes that his father being kidnapped was less stressful on him than making this movie or
Yeah,
making that movie.
yeah, I just read that apparently those two things happened at the same time or relatively close together, and his father was held captive for like 18 days. Or was it longer than I don't remember, but it was a long chunk of time. And for some reason, he felt that was less stressful because at least he understood the terms of what was happening. Whereas his film set was so chaotic and out of control that it was an entirely different breed of stressful, which is wild to think about that your father being kidnapped would somehow be less stressful than the movie that you're making.
So I think I might have saw this movie later than you. So I knew of its existence. I'd heard about it. I'd heard several horror fans and sci-fi fans, fantasy fans, people that love genre films talk about how good this movie is. But I don't know if it was like hard to find a copy or what. But I know when I had a Netflix, and this is dating me, a Netflix subscription where you get the DVDs in the mail before it was a streaming service, or right when they were starting to do streaming too. I rented it through Netflix when I got a Netflix account. And that's how I watched this film for the first time. And I think I had seen all his other movies to that point. And this is around the time everything up to Hellboy 2 I think had come out. But what I really liked about this movie, and I think for a long time a lot of people tended to say his Spanish language films were better than his American films,
Hmm.
is that I think he tapped into something more interesting. And maybe it's because people think they're getting one thing and then it turns like if you just told somebody what this movie was about and then they watched it, they might be disappointed because it's not really a ghost story. That's just kind of the backdrop of what's going on. The same thing with Pan's Labyrinth. It's not really a fantasy film. That's just kind of the fluff to get into it.
Yeah, it's almost like the genre stuff is somehow incidental to what's going on at the core of these stories, and yet it is sort of the framework and the foundation for it all. So I think something that's really great about Del Toro's work is how those two things go hand in hand so much. Um, the themes and the worlds that the stories take place in, they blend so well together that it's sometimes difficult to parse, which one is the predominant factor in the storytelling. Because you can watch these movies and not really know anything about the Spanish Civil War or the rise of Spanish fascism and walk away thinking it was a damn good movie. Or you can go into it with that history and that knowledge and come away with a completely different take, still thinking it was a damn good movie, but for very different reasons. So I think he's super talented in that way. Some filmmakers I think get a little too caught up in the thematic stuff. Some get a little bit too caught up in the spectacle stuff, and one ends up outweighing the other. Whereas Del Toro seems to be of an even mind, and he's able to balance them very well.
I agree. I think almost all of his movies he tends to use both elements like something like Crimson Peak. You think it's a ghost story, but it's a gothic romance. But he uses the genre tropes to play into the themes that he wants to use in the story.
Yeah, Crimson Peak is one that I definitely need to revisit. I've only seen it once, and it was back when it came out. And I think I need to go back into it now, knowing more. So I know more about, Gothic romance and literature today than I did back then. So I don't think I was fully able to grasp everything that he was going for. Kind of like that Devil's Backbone scenario that we just went over. You can go into a movie and just watch it for what it is and enjoy it, versus going into it with all that thematic stuff in mind and getting something grander out of it. So I think I need to revisit Crimson Peak to get even more out of it, I think.
And what I think is really interesting is there's a big gap in his career with these first three films. He
Hmm.
makes his first film, which was also well received, but not, didn't really make a splash really anywhere besides the festival circuit. I guess maybe it was bigger in Mexico. I know that apparently Spanish filmmaker Pedro Alma, he really
Almodovar?
liked. Yeah, he really liked it, and I think helped finance this film because he said, "I want to help produce your next movie."
Yeah, I read that as well. That Almodovar was aware of Del Toro's grievances on Mimic, but was such a big fan of Kronos that he wanted to give him the opportunity to sort of go back to his roots, which is what Del Toro wanted to do anyway. And Almodovar, being such a strong auteur himself, was perfectly willing to just let Del Toro go and create something without, all the oversight and the nitpicking and all the studio contractual stuff that Mimic was getting itself involved with.
And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why he wanted to make this movie before, even though he had the offer to make Blade 2. He discusses, I listened to a podcast where he's interviewed by filmmaker Mick Garris, and he talked about like he had the offer, they were ready to make the movie, and he's like, but I need to make this movie first. And his agent's like, what are you doing? Make Blade 2, then go make your little personal ghost story movie. And he's like, no, trust me, if I don't make this movie, I don't think I'm gonna continue being a filmmaker. I need this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really respect his ability to understand himself, just his self awareness that he knew for his own mental health and his own artistry that he had to sort of cleanse his artistic palette by making this personal ghost story before jumping off to this big, big budget vampire action movie.
Yeah, because a lot of people in that situation, even if they had the same feelings that Del Toro had, especially with the nightmarish aspect of making Mimic, they would probably take the paycheck because they're like, I gotta eat, I gotta pay the rent, so I'll make this movie, and then if it's a success, hopefully I can get my personal film financed. So yeah, that's big of him to know that like, no, this is not just for myself as a creator and a professional, but it's also for my mental health and as an artist. If I don't do this, then I'm gonna have to decide what do I want to do for the rest of my life.
Yeah, more directors could use Del Toro's self awareness, I think.
I mean, it's a very strange place where directors are now. It's weird how a director will make a very critical and popular indie film and now they get a huge blockbuster right after, whereas used to you would get like a mid-budget movie before they decide to give you a bigger budget film.
Yeah. The first example that I'm thinking of is I can't think of his name, Colin something. He did Safety Not Guaranteed, and then he went off to do what, Jurassic World, was it? Like that was his
Yeah.
like that was he went from little tiny Safety Not Guaranteed to massive Jurassic World in a matter of a few years. It's wild.
Yeah, it's very crazy because you look at Christopher Nolan. And Christopher Nolan had to make Insomnia between Memento and Batman Begins. And
Hmm.
like now that Insomnia movie is like not there anymore. Now it's like straight to Batman Begins.
Yeah, it's funny how this last decade, it almost seems like the mid-budget studio movie has gone by the wayside. Now there's just like the indie world and there's like the Marvel world. And there's not really that middle ground's not quite as common now as it was in the 90s and the 2000s.
Yeah, the all your mid-budget stuff is now TV shows or a Netflix miniseries or something.
Or yeah, or a small studio film that's trying to pass itself off as indie.
Like they asked Billy Bob Thornton several years ago why he was doing the Fargo TV show, and he said because that's where the interesting dramatic work for an actor that's not like a super low budget indie or a blockbuster is television.
Right. Yeah, television's really come a long way in terms of how it's perceived by the industry. It's not too long ago when that was considered, beneath you if you went to TV, and now it's like all the best actors, directors, and writers are turning to it as their go-to medium where they're feeling appreciated.
For sure. And what I didn't know about this movie, Devil's Backbone, was that Guillermo del Toro had already developed the script before he made Chronos. And
Yeah.
apparently this deals with his uncle. Apparently he says his uncle was a ghost. I don't know if that's true or not. This is
Right.
Del
Yeah.
Toro's
In
personal.
in the little booklet that came with my Criterion Collection Blu-ray, it has that little anecdote about his uncle and ghostliness, and how apparently he had written the script like 18 years before it was actually made or something. But yeah, that was a cute little story, and how he like made deals with the ghosts and the monsters in his childhood home so they would become friends, so they wouldn't try to kill him. It's kind of cute.
Yeah, and he talks about how this is more of a culturally accepted thing where he grew up. Like there's more acceptance of the supernatural and it's not considered just fairy tales or ghost stories. Like it's real to them.
Right. He comes from a much more spiritual background where these things aren't something to be made fun of or necessarily something to fear. Um, I'm sure, there are the dangerous and the malicious spirits out there, but just because something is from the other side doesn't inherently mean that it's evil, where he comes from.
Yeah, and I like that's what I like about this movie so much is like yes, it's creepy and it's scary, but once you like kind of unveil all the layers, the ghost is really not scary at all.
Right. Yeah, the movie, even though it is it's technically it's a ghost story, it's not necessarily one that's trying to scare you. It uses these haunting images and this disturbing story about a child being murdered as its foundation. But when I was rewatching it, it occurred to me that I don't think Del Toro was ever actively trying to scare the audience. He was just telling this story his way, and his way happens to be darker and more supernatural. That's just his way of interpreting this time in history.
So what do you love about this particular film? Now, I know when I asked you to guess, I can't remember. I think we had more than this movie left. We may have just had two movies left. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
I think you had offered me this and Mimic,
That makes sense. Yeah.
and I almost went with Mimic because I do enjoy it as a ridiculous mutant cockroach blockbuster movie. But Devil's Backbone's a little more personal to me. Um, so I watched this soon after the Pan's Labyrinth came out, and it had gotten all of its Oscar glory, and it was a big critical hit. And I was still figuring myself out when I watched this movie, and I'm now an out gay man, but I wasn't back then. I probably would have been like 15 or so when I watched this for the first time in mostly conservative Ohio, and or at least that region of Ohio outside of the town was pretty conservative. And there was something about this movie that struck me: the camaraderie between the young boys, and the subtle homoerotic relationship between a couple of them, and then Eduardo Noriega. Even though we're not supposed to like him as a person, there was something about him that was drawing me in on like a sexual level as a teenage closeted boy. And so it's a movie that as a whole just made me feel a lot of uh, moving and confusing things at the same time. And just on top of being just a really cool ghost story, um, it worked on me. So I like this movie on a few different levels.
Yeah, I mean there's so many layers to this movie that you don't see on the surface. And I think, every movie does something to everybody differently. That's why this is so subjective art form. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the actor you listed, that is the actor who plays kind of the villain of this
Yeah,
film.
yeah. I'm blanking on the character's name, but Eduardo Noriega plays, the younger man who used to be an orphan there, and he's out for the gold that's secretly being stashed in the orphanage that's supposed to help fund the war effort and all that. But yeah, he's a villainous dude, and as the movie goes on, you learn more and more awful things about him. But there was something about him that was just making me feel weird things when I was 15.
I think that's what he's supposed to do as a character
Yeah,
because he has two relationships. He has a sexual relationship with the school teacher there, even though I think she despises him of who he is as a human.
yeah,
And then he has a little thing going on with the younger lady that works for the school, who she's too sweet to be dealt up with him, but it could be of a circumstance. Well, he's the only guy around that I know.
yeah. This place is pretty remote. Um, like it takes hours to drive anywhere. And at one point, she's gonna walk to town, and she's like, "If I leave now, I'll get there by noon tomorrow." Like that's just how far away they are from anything. And I guess I can see how if he's the only guy, uh, he's kind of your romantic interest by default.
Well, I mean, especially for her because it's an old guy and a bunch of 12-year-old boys,
Yep,
so
she doesn't have very many options.
exactly. The thing that bothers me, and I think this actor gives a really good performance of being both dangerous and what, like you said, like there's a little bit of sexy appeal to him. I don't know if it's just his raw masculinity or his looks or his energy. So it's there. But what bothers me personally about him and why I don't like him, which of course I guess you're not supposed to like him as a character, he looks very similar to me like Eli Roth. And I am not a big Eli Roth fan.
Yeah,
So
it's kind of funny. I was revisiting this movie, and my first thought was Colin Farrell. And then there was a moment, it was when, after he's been beaten and he's been sort of banished and he's sent to walk away, he has a moment where he sort of halfway turns back, and I got an Eli Roth vibe from him. So I think he's like a Spanish Colin Farrell, Eli Roth hybrid.
mm, well, I like the Colin Farrell better than the Eli
Yeah.
Roth. Yeah, but yeah, I can see some of the Colin Farrell vibes too. That maybe that'll help. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think he's a very complex and well drawn out character because from the beginning, he's not a nice guy, but as the film progresses, you just see how more atrocious he is and what he's willing to do just for personal gain.
Right. Yeah, he's a dastardly sort of dude, which I guess can appeal to certain people um, on a romantic level, and sort of like that dark, twisted, romantic kind of level, because he has like the perfect presence to be this character. He has that masculine quality that you mentioned. He's like muscular, but not too muscular. He has a vibe about him where he just gives off this sort of off-putting energy. Um, And I think the actor really taps into all that. You can see how how the kids could fear him and also revere him in a dangerous sort of way, and how he also appeals to these women around him, despite how terrible he is, how everyone knows he's not the best human being.
Yeah, and I think that quality you mentioned, I think the character Jaime, I think has a kind of, he fears him and despises him, but he also like kind of looks up to him because Jaime has a little crush on the young woman that works there, and he's like, because that was one thing I liked in the movie when Jaime and Carlos go to get water and they're kind of spying on them, and I'm like, yeah, that's what kids do, because I think
Yeah,
anything adults do is interesting, even if it's so mundane and boring. They just want to know what's going on in the adult world.
right. The Jaime character is so complex in this movie, more so than I've ever given him credit for prior to this most recent time I watched it, because he's definitely crushing on the young woman. Um, he gives her the little cigar
Mm-hmm.
band as a ring, but I also wasn't sure if he had a romantic crush on Santi, the young boy who ends up dying. I couldn't tell. Is this just a non-toxic fraternal bond that they have? And we're so accustomed to fraternity being toxic that a non-toxic relationship looks romantic, or was there actually something there? Because there's times where, I mean, I can speak from personal experience where two young men can be friendly with each other and they don't realize until years later that they were actually crushing. You know, you just think you have this unique connection with someone and you think it's, just your standard friendship. And then you realize, thinking back on it, oh, I was actually into him in a way that I didn't comprehend. So I don't know if maybe Jaime and Santi had something that like that, or if I was just maybe looking into it a little too deeply.
Who knows? I mean, it could be there, but even if it's not, you interpreted it that way, and that could also explain like how defensive he is about Carlos coming in, Carlos taking his bed, like, well, that was my friend. And of course, at that age, he wouldn't know if that
Yeah,
was like more than what's going on. And especially in that time period and in that culture
right.
of like where that's, because, like, in the movie, I guess maybe they weren't Catholic because they're like, well, now we have to, because, they're pulling out the crucifix of Jesus and the statue of Mary. They're like, I guess now we're a Catholic society.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I've settled on. That I think I'm okay with my reading of it being very, very subtle homoerotic, but in a way where the two characters don't quite realize it yet because they haven't reached that point in their life. I think maybe someday Jaime will realize that that's why he was so defensive about anything regarding Santi and anything he construed as being disrespectful to his dead friend.
And I like that Del Toro doesn't just paint these children as caricatures. Like, you could easily have just made Jaime the bully
Yeah,
in this movie, but he doesn't, because once Jaime realizes that Carlos is okay, he's just a kid too. Like, then he's like, well, we gotta, and especially after the explosion, he's like, we've gotta help. We gotta help all the other kids. We've gotta protect each other.
yeah. Yeah, he lets these children be completely three-dimensional in a way that a lot of directors and screenwriters don't bother with their child characters. And I think the actor um, is perfectly competent to do it. This is a character who very easily could have just been, that the bully, and that's it. Just the hothead, the one who lashes out. But I don't. I think he's much more complicated as a character than another storyteller may have given him credit for.
Yes, and that's in real life too. Now, I'm not saying there's not just deplorable, terrible people who enjoy being terrible, but a lot of times when you peel back, why is someone a bully? It's usually something has happened or
Hmm.
something is going on in their life at home. There's usually a reason why a child is a bully to another child.
Right. Yeah, there's usually something that needs to be brought out through some sort of like psychoanalysis or therapy, something that's either happened to the child or they're responding to something else happening in their life. Not to excuse the horrible things that they do, but it can be an explanation for why they're behaving the way they are.
Even if it's just some sort of insecurity that comes from them being bullied themselves at home or
Sure.
from a mentor or peer or something, and then they lash it out on someone that they perceive to be weaker than them, which is what I love about Carlos too, because he immediately does not put up with that. Like when he accidentally knocks over the water and he's like, well, you got to get more. He's like, well, you're coming with me. What, are
Yeah.
you scared?
Right. Yeah, he's quite an authoritative young man, and not necessarily in like a bossy way. He just accepts leadership positions very quickly. And, you don't know much about his father, but you get the impression that his father, who has recently died, was a person of power who had some sort of authoritative role. And perhaps, Carlos picked up on that. Maybe it's genetic, but yeah, he's a very strong young man.
Well, I mean, he had to be somewhat well to do. He didn't have to be necessarily rich, but his father
Mhm.
must have had some sort of reliable and a lot of income because he had a tutor and he's
Yeah.
certainly more educated than most of the boys at this orphanage.
Yeah, and he's coming in with comics and other little toys that show off the difference in social class. They may not have been super wealthy, but Carlos's family was definitely more well off than probably any of the other boys' family in this orphanage.
Well, most of these boys are probably either from pregnancies that were not wanted or families that probably had more children than they could afford to take care of.
Right.
Also, there's a war going on, so they probably might have had family members die and there was no next of kin. I mean, there's a lot of traumatic circumstances that these boys have been in and why they're at this place. Oh, I lost them. So looks like I lost my guess. So we're going to talk about the movie a little bit more. This is just a wonderfully drawn out film. Oh, there he is.
In there. Am I back?
Uh, yeah, you're back. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, I don't
Did
know.
you?
I don't know. It just cut out. Like
Yeah.
my browser just went. Pfft, and I had to
I
like
was
open
like,
it
oh
back up.
no.
But as soon as I opened it back up, it went right back into the stream. So I don't know what's going on.
Well, glad you're back.
Hopefully that didn't disrupt your recording.
It's fine. I was just rambling for about 30 seconds,
Okay.
talking
Sorry.
about how good the movie. It's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
I gotta say, I think my favorite character is the Doctor in this movie.
Yeah. I
And
like him.
this actor had worked with Del Toro previously in Kronos. He's also in Pan's Labyrinth. He wanted him to play the shoe polisher grandfather character in Mimic, but apparently his English was not strong enough for the film. So he does always kind of play these fatherly roles, but I like that there's that balance is where you have the younger man who's completely toxic, but you have this older gentleman who is very kind-hearted, always looks for the best intentions, is treats everyone the same. And even when he gets onto the boys, like he doesn't like berate them or punish them. Like, he figures out who helped Carlos without even having Carlos like say anything. He's like, they're just gonna look up to see if he ratted them out.
Yeah, he's a very perceptive and wise man, and the actor who plays him gives such a warm performance that I kind of felt something when it's revealed that he has died. Because when I think is it Jaime or is it Carlos who goes back and closes the eyes, but
It it's Jaime.
yeah,
Jaime finds him dead there.
yeah, and there's a before you realize for sure that he has died. There, if you look closely, there's like a fly that crawls across his bottom lip, which is such a great tell on Del Toro's part. It and I had a moment where I sank for a little bit, realizing that he had died. I knew that he would die because of course I'd seen this movie before, but going back through it again, the actor is so good that I managed to actually, feel a little something knowing what was coming and seeing that little detail with the insect crawling across his face.
Yeah, this film is heavily with a lot of the themes Del Toro likes to play with. We have looking through the eyes of a child. We have bugs. We have a cross of the well, it's spiritual, but we have the cross of religious overtones, but with the supernatural kind of coming together.
Yeah,
which
yeah,
which is part of the culture of what he grew up in, because Mexico is very heavily a Catholic country, but and Catholicism itself is more so within the spiritual realm than other Christian religions are.
right. Yeah, I was not brought up in a particularly Christian household. It was more of like just this general agnosticism, I guess. Like most of my family would say that they believed that there was a God, but it wasn't necessarily like the Christian God, and maybe perhaps they defaulted to Christianity if they had to like name a religion. But watching these movies like as an adult is always so interesting because I didn't grow up um, with that storytelling, with that with those religious parallels being in my mind. So I know Del Toro, I think, has described himself as a lapsed Catholic, but I have other Catholic friends, and it seems like when you are brought up Catholic, you can never escape it. It sounds like. Um,
It's a little bit like the mafia. Like, I was born and raised Catholic, but I haven't been to mass in quite a while. But I can list here and tell you all the atrocious things the Catholic Church has done, and I don't agree with a lot of the things that they teach. But at the same time, when I have Protestant friends who will try to say things that aren't necessarily true about the Catholic Church, the negative connotations that people think Catholics do, I will defend it, because, like all organized religion, there's good intentions in there, but it's the people that bring it up, or that say they're the followers or teachers of it, sometimes will be the worst spokespeople for it.
right. Yeah. I think some folks are really quick to blame just the general concept of religion on a lot of problems. I know a lot of people in the LGBTQ community are want to do that because religion for a lot of queer people was weaponized against them when they were young, and so they grow resentful, and any allusion to religion sort of triggers something within them. Now, like I said, I didn't grow up in a religious household, so that's not something that I particularly dealt with. But I think that is true that some people have a tendency to generalize and blanket their grievances in a way that I think is a little bit unfair to the folks who are non-toxic with their religion, I guess you could say. So it's a more complex issue that I think some people are willing to let it be.
Well, and I perfectly understand how anybody would feel, especially if there was sort of some conversion trying thing to happen to them, or people telling them they're going to hell, it's a sin. I mean, I have friends who have had so many negative experiences with churches, with
Mm-hmm.
what people did. But I'm not here to defend any kind of practice. I just think that the intentions are good within the foundation. I think it's the people that corrupt it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily the religion itself. I think it's usually always the people.
Yeah, it's the people take the scriptures or whatever and use it for their own gain to try to hurt people. So yeah, it's usually the bad people taking something that was never real. I guess I shouldn't say never, but something that may not have been intended to be harmful and making it harmful. You know.
Mm-hmm. That's another thing I love about this doctor character, because when he's talking to Carlos, he's like, I'm a man of science. This is all superstitious. And then he offers, like, if you think this is real, go ahead, take a drink of it.
Mm. Yeah, that was I had forgotten all about that drink with the like fetus inside of it, and it took me a moment to realize what exactly was going on. And I was like, I don't remember this at all, and yeah, that threw me off a little bit because it'd been a minute since I'd last seen this movie.
He's also a very sad character. Even though he's so
Mm.
warm and fatherly, he's very sad because he's madly in love with this woman. And I don't know if, like, I think she sort of has feelings for him, but maybe they're not as strong as his feelings. Or maybe, I don't know. And maybe he's just afraid to act on them because he knew her husband and they worked together. I mean, I know there's like a little thing with the villain guy saying, "Yeah, he's too old. He can't do what you need sexually." But he
Right.
he defends her till, well, to the death.
Yeah. Yeah. He's a he. There's a sadness to him, which is interesting because he ends up becoming a ghost in the end, and the ghosts in a lot of Del Toro's work are really sad at their core. You know, they're not really vengeful spirits in the way that a lot of horror creators will take ghosts and make them these sort of malicious entities from the other side meant to do us harm. For Del Toro, and particularly in The Devil's Backbone, they're people who are unfulfilled in life or have some sort of unfinished business that needs to be resolved in order for them to move on. And Santi has some great sadness to him, and this doctor fellow uh, takes some sadness with him into the next realm, and it sort of comes full circle in that way.
And he is still able to save the boys even though he dies, because he's the one that lets them out of the room.
Yeah, it's sort of it reminded me of The Shining a little bit with Grady letting Jack out of the cupboard. If that's your interpretation, I know that some people will get a little heated about that. Some people don't think that's what happened, but
Oh,
I don't know.
I didn't know that. I just knew, there's the people that, like Stephen King, don't like the movie, and
Yeah,
then there's, because they want it closer to the book, and then there's
right.
people that are like, but he did an adaptation and decided that, like, well, no, the horror is them trapped in a motel with a very toxic individual,
Hmm.
and like that's just the spooky stuff's just adds on to it, like, but that's not the real horror in that movie. To me, the real horror is Jack Torrance.
Yeah.
And I think maybe Stephen King's a little too close to the character, because I don't think Stephen King's quite as toxic as Jack Torrance is, but King has dealt with alcohol and drug abuse, and
Hmm.
he's a writer. So there might be a little bit of his inner demons in Jack Torrance. So
That could be.
seeing an interpretation that's not what he envisioned, because I think he thinks Jack deep down is a good person, and like
He's
the evil,
redeemable.
he's redeemable, and the evil in the hotel just brings out his darkness. Whereas I think Kubrick's like, no, this guy was already bad, and like this just makes him worse. Like it
Yeah.
just puts it to the full front, which is interesting because Kubrick himself was a pretty toxic guy.
Oh yeah. He was really abusive of his actors,
Especially Shelley Duvall. But
right?
that's one thing I've never heard about Guillermo del Toro is like he seems like everyone that works with him loves working with him.
Yeah. I don't know if this is true or this is just something that was just on Tumblr or whatever, but a friend sent me this post about the production of Pacific Rim, and there's a Japanese child actor who is in the film who could not pronounce Guillermo's name. Like she just couldn't form the sounds, and it made her embarrassed, and she didn't know how to address him because she couldn't say his name. And they were talking, and apparently they bonded over the film My Neighbor Totoro, and
Oh,
and he gave her special permission to call him Totoro. So only
so
she on
adorable.
set, well, Totoro-san, I believe, with the
Yeah,
and only she was allowed to call him that apparently, and that was like their special thing because she could say that name.
that's so
So
cute. I'm probably gonna steal that for my Pacific Rim episode
yeah,
now.
yeah, it was somewhere on Tumblr. A friend sent it to me a long time ago.
I mean, that just makes me think of him more as a lovable guy because that's my favorite Miyazaki film. And he kind of does give off like Totoro energy to me, like in interviews and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, he seems like a really kind-hearted person.
I did hear, though, that like for his direction for one of I think it's the child actor that plays Carlos, like to get him off the performances, he would tell him like how disappointed he was and something to try and get him to, I guess, get the emotions he needed out of him.
Yeah, I mean that's okay. I think as a director, I think things that the stories you hear about Kubrick are more abusive. Um, I think Del Toro, the ways he might have been manipulating his actors' emotions, was more productive and as a way to make them maybe dig a little deeper or go a little further, as opposed to just beating someone down over and over again, like you hear of Kubrick doing.
Well, you can be critical and judge judge someone's performance and even be negative without being abusive. I mean, as an
Yeah,
actor, you got to take constructive criticism all the time from the filmmaker, but you can do it in a way to where you don't belittle and make someone feel like less than human.
right. Like there's a difference between criticism that's meant to build somebody up versus criticism that's meant to tear somebody down. And it seems like Del Toro is one who always wants to build people up.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we are. I don't think we're quite there, but I'm glad we're getting to a point in society where we're not apologizing for people's terrible behavior just because they happen to be very talented.
Yeah, I think we're getting to a better place with that. Some think are a little bit too apologetic of their faves to go there yet, but I think as a society, we're doing a little bit better about that whole art from the artist nonsense.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not here to tell people you can stop enjoying things that a terrible person made. Just acknowledge that, okay, I like this film or this TV show, but this
Yeah,
person's not a good person, but they happen to make a thing I like.
yeah. Roxanne Gay wrote a really good essay about that. I don't remember where she published it, but you can probably just Google Roxanne Gay art from the artist or something. And that's basically what she said is there's no real way to separate an artist from their art and their life. You just kind of have to accept everything and just own that you like this horrible thing, but know why you like this horrible thing. And there's a way of doing both at the same time. one doesn't necessarily negate the other. You just kind of have to accept the situation for what it is.
Yeah. That being said, on this particular episodes of podcast, I have decided that I'm not going to do particular directors that I know have been guilty of certain atrocious things. That's not saying I wouldn't ever talk about one of their movies, but I'm not
Yeah,
going to do like a dedicated series of all their films
sure. Yeah,
because that's more of celebrating them than a particular film. Like, I'm not going to do a Bryan Singer series. It's not going to happen. I might
yeah,
talk about the usual suspects, but I'm not going to go into all of his films as a series. Plus, I don't think he's that
yeah,
good of a director, anyways.
right,
But
right. Like you can cite how influential Rosemary's Baby has been on the horror genre without celebrating Roman Polanski, the human being. You know,
exactly, you could talk about how great Chinatown is without talking about Roman Polanski.
right,
It's there. It is difficult and it is frustrating. It seems like every day we're learning something new about somebody, and it's like, oh, well, that's a shame. But
right.
it's the reality, and I'm glad that we're getting to a point where we're not excusing it anymore, where it's like being hush hushed. Well, they're good, so what are we gonna do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thankfully, it seems like Del Toro is a non-problematic fave, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, to my knowledge, I haven't heard anything terrible about him. I mean, I know he got a divorce. I don't know the circumstances of his divorce, but
Well, that happens.
it happens. I mean, you don't always have to have done something atrocious to end a
Yeah.
relationship. Interesting about this film, this is the only Guillermo Del Toro film that doesn't feature Ron Perlman or Doug Jones.
Oh wow. Yeah, I guess that is true. Hmm. Yeah, I kind of dig that actually. I mean, I like Ron Perlman and Doug Jones, of course, but I kind of like this has this that distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind directors working with similar actors again and again. I mean, if you have a good working relationship and they tend to get your material, they tend to jive with what you're trying to create. That's
Right.
fine, but I do like it when directors try to work with different actors. I mean, he is working with one similar actor,
Yeah.
but like Wes Anderson, sometimes you're like, okay, these are all the same people that have been in every Wes Anderson movie.
Right.
So I'm always happy when they want to work with new people.
Sorry, I just had to go to the charger.
No, you're good. You're good. I
Okay. Yeah, it's
think the
charging.
only other performance we haven't delved into was probably the school teacher. What do you think of this actor's performance? There's also a little bit of sadness in her too.
Oh, the young lady.
Well, I was talking about the older lady, but we can talk about the young
Oh,
lady
oh
too.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I really dig her. There is a certain sadness to her with, you know, uh, her spouse dying and her being widowed and all that. And there's something that draws her to the Eduardo Noriega character, which is kind of weird considering, he was a former orphan there. And
Mm-hmm.
it kind of makes you wonder what's going on with her and how she's able to, separate this man that he is today from the child that she kind of raised,
Mm-hmm.
and now works for her. So there's something funny going on with her that I kind of want to know more about. And I don't. Did they establish why she lost her leg? I can't recall.
I don't remember them specifying why she lost her leg. And I
Yeah.
think I think part of Noriega's resentment is that I think he resents having to live at that orphanage. It doesn't really go into why his parents sent him there too much. I know he finds a photo and he says that's his parents, but I
Right.
think he has like a hatred of that place, and that he's still there, I think also is why he's so despicable.
Yeah, he's never really been able to escape that place. And I guess I can see why that would come with a certain level of bitterness. Because I mean, I always kind of wanted to escape my hometown, and I ultimately did. Sometimes I wonder if I had stayed there forever, how I would feel about that. Um, so I guess I can sort of relate to him if I try.
Well, that just makes a more interesting antagonist if there's something you can relate to him. I mean, I'm perfectly fine with the black and white of good versus evil in some things, but I do like when there's shades of gray in the characters.
Yeah, yeah. I think even though he's meant to be this, force of evil, there's something to him that is still very human. Like Del Toro doesn't try to make him just, this two-dimensional threat. He's actually a person with a complicated past who's been through a lot that led him to being the toxic person that he is today. And that doesn't necessarily excuse his behavior. It just gives you that explication as to why he is so angry all the time.
And the other thing that's really interesting about the orphanage and the schoolmaster mistress is not only is she running this orphanage and teaching these boys, she also seems to be like a harbor for the people fighting in the war.
Right, because they're storing all this gold here at this orphanage. It's in the middle of nowhere. So in a way it seems like a really smart place for this like tiny Fort Knox to exist in like rural Spain. So I kind of want to know more about the what's going on her end of the war front. But considering, the story is mostly told from the child's point of view, you don't really get that much other than, what you need to know for the story to move forward. But I kind of want to know more about this war effort that's going on and the resistance.
Right. I feel like there's like another movie within this movie that we could have, like, what's going on with the sides, and I guess they're opposing the fascist government why there's a civil war, and they're trying to be a safe harbor. Like the doctor goes into town to give supplies and medicine.
Yeah, it kind of makes me want Del Toro to tackle the Spanish Civil War and the rise of fascism just outright. Like he's used it as a backdrop a couple of times, and now I'm just curious, and I just want to see his version of that, with that being like the primary plot focus.
And you mentioned the younger lady. I think she's probably the sweetest person in this movie, probably the least complex too, as far as like the doctor's sweet too, but he's got a lot of layers to him. I don't know if that's
Yeah,
life experience or just some of the stuff he's seen throughout his life, and especially the war that's taken a toll. But I think she's probably the most optimistic person in at this orphanage, or at least sees the best in people.
yeah. She's sort of a key component to the narrative, considering her sweetness balances out the sourness of you know the other character there. But yeah, she doesn't have quite as much depth to her as some of the other adults in this movie. Um, I don't find her quite as interesting as I do really any of the other adults in this movie. She's sort of just I don't want to be reductive, but in a way, it seems like she's almost just a puppet in the story. Um, she's there to be the love interest, or well, the love interest to a couple different characters that kind of motivates them and gives them a reason to lash out at each other. Uh, it seems like just when she's about to gain some autonomy and march for a day and a half to get help, she's killed. So she's not quite as interesting as some of the other characters, but definitely an important factor in how the story plays out.
Yeah, she's certainly of the four core adults in this movie, not as complex or drawn out as the other three individuals are. But she has some really good moments, especially where she stands up to Noriega and is like, I'm not afraid of you anymore.
Right.
Even though she knows she's probably going to get killed, but she's just witnessed him burn down a school and try to murder people. So,
Yeah, that is a cool moment. Um, I don't trying to remember. I can't recall if that level of strength had ever been displayed on her part before, but that moment where he's, asking her to apologize to him because he's so insecure and she won't do it in front of his friends and he's getting, upset, is a cool little scene, and I'm glad that Del Toro is able to give her that. Uh, I just don't know if we'd ever seen anything like that from her before. Maybe if we had, I would feel a little differently about the character, because maybe there would be more substance to her. But up until that final moment where she, leaves the orphanage and then gets murdered, there's not a whole lot to her. She's just kind of there to motivate the young men.
exactly, because I think she's there not only for Noriega, but she's there for Jaime. Like there's a really sweet moment when he gives her the cigar wrapping or holding as a ring, and she puts it on and gives him a very innocent kiss on the cheek. I don't know if that would be construed innocent
I think on
in other
her,
ways, but for
yeah,
that purposes, it does come off innocent.
I think for her it's innocent. I think she was just, displaying some friendly affection for this boy who had just given her a gift, because she has no feelings for Jaime,
Oh yeah,
but he does. So for him, or he has feelings for her. So for him, it means a lot more. It means something different. So so yeah, it's a cool little exchange there, but I just wish we had a little bit more from her as a autonomous character.
yeah, and I don't know if maybe she's just there to kind of give Jaime that reason to help stand up against Noriega later in the movie. And
Yeah, because I mean, him giving Jaime back the cigar wrapper is like the clue to him that something horrible has happened to this woman that he's in love with, and that's sort of it's sort of a tipping point for Jaime to kill him. Like he had always wanted to, but that was the thing that
that's
pushed
what
him over the
broke that's
edge.
what broke it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cuz I mean, yeah, these other three adults, there's so much going on that's not even like on the screen, but you can tell by their performances that there's like so much going on, like backstory and everything that's not there for her. And that may be, there's just too many characters to juggle around, and unfortunately some characters don't get as much in depth because you have those three characters, you have Carlos, you have Jaime, you have the ghost. There's a lot going on in this movie.
yeah, yeah. Not all characters can have that level of depth. Some just frankly aren't quite as important as the others.
And then you have a whole war going on in the background. But the other thing I love that he does in this movie, besides finding out that the ghost isn't really the scary part of the story, or that's not really what the movie's about. I love how he makes things scary that are scary to kids, that aren't necessarily really scary in the world. But when you're a kid and you got to go somewhere, you're trying to go somewhere in the middle of the night, especially if you got to go outside to get there, it's kind of creepy.
Yeah, sometimes when you're a kid, going someplace that's off limits in the dark is scarier than a, a ghost.
For sure. I remember being a kid not wanting to go into the back rooms of our house because no one stayed in those rooms. They were basically there for like storage, and it's dark, and we lived in a very old house. So I was like, I don't want to go in those rooms. Like I remember like getting whatever my mom wanted me to get, and then like running like to get out of the room.
Right. Yeah, Del Toro seems to be pretty in touch with how children view the world and the things that they find scary versus the things that adults find scary.
And I appreciate that because I feel like so many filmmakers do not write or direct children well, and children come off as just caricatures of what they think children should behave like. And I think in all of his films where children are at the center point, they are portrayed accurately as how a real child would behave.
Yeah, without ever like condescending or belittling them from the script or from the camera. He still respects these characters even more so than a lot of other directors do with their child characters.
I mean, I'm sure there are more, but the only other two movies that come to my mind where I feel like children are behaved accurately and not dumbed down for audiences is To Kill a Mockingbird and E.T.
Yeah, E.T. is a go-to example for that. Spielberg is pretty consistent with giving his child actors some depth. Like, yeah, he definitely doesn't speak down to his child characters either.
Yeah. Is there anything else about this movie you want to talk about that you think we haven't talked about yet before we talk about ratings for this?
Um, I think the design of the Santi ghost is really cool. Um, the way the blood sort of, I don't even know the word, it sort of just like evaporates upward, as as a reference to him sinking into the pool as the blood's coming out of his head. It's a cool image, and I like the ghostly aesthetic. It reminds me of Quaidon. Quaidon, not sure how to say it. There's a Japanese ghost film from like the 60s, and some of the makeup is reminiscent of that, and I really dig it. So yeah, I think the design of that ghost is cool.
I would have to agree. I really like how Santi looks because you can see like a little bit of decaying, like as a corpse and a zombie, but it still has that ghost effect of like how we think ghosts look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And yeah,
it's indisputable. Like when you see him, you know that's a ghost. Like there's no question as to what other quote unquote creature or monster he's meant to be. You see Santi and you know he's meant to be the ghost of a child.
and I wonder because I know Del Toro is not a big CGI user. I know he's used some of it, and I wonder if how they did that effect because it looks like it's CGI, but I'm wondering how much of that's practical.
I don't know. I'm not sure if it's practical, if it's a practical effect that's augmented with some CGI VFX work, but it still reads like my Criterion Blu-ray looks great. It doesn't look phony at all.
Yeah, I got that as well because this one is a little bit harder to find to stream. So when they had the sale, I bought it. And yeah, I was watching it and I was like, I cannot tell this effect is 20 years old like other films of this era. It like looks really good. And I know this movie couldn't have cost that much to make.
Right. Yeah, it holds up. Whatever he did, it looks great still.
I mean, I know it was financed concurrently with Mexico and Spain, and they shot this in Spain. But yeah, the effect looks amazing. And, Del Toro loves and respects monsters in a way that other filmmakers probably would just present the monsters as a monster.
Right. Yeah, there's more humanity to Del Toro's monsters than probably any other director of monster films these days.
For sure. The only other director I could think of that would give his monsters humanity would be Tim Burton.
Yeah. Yeah, but
Not
even
so much.
yeah,
Not
not
so
so much
much.
these days.
No, I feel like now he just kind of makes things that he thinks people want out of a Tim Burton movie, or this is what a Tim Burton movie is supposed to look like.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how Tim Burton's movies have almost become Tim Burton camp at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Like he is camp of himself at this point. It's so weird.
Yeah. Anything else? And if not, we're gonna talk about how we rate the Del Toro movies.
I think I'm good.
All right. So since I said it's the fantastical world of Guillermo del Toro, if you love this movie or think it's great or a masterpiece, we're going to call it fantastic. If you enjoy the movie as entertainment or find it a solid, well made film, we call it a delightful creature feature. If it doesn't quite hit the mark, if it's a little mediocre, it doesn't quite hit up to standards of his other films. We're like, he cared too much for the monsters.
Hmm.
And then if it's terrible, if it's just a complete wreck or failure, Cthulhu wrecks all because we know Del Toro loves some H.P. Lovecraft and Cthulhu.
Okay.
So what do you
So
think about this one?
I would give the Devil's Backbone the top rating. I think I guess fantastical is the answer. Um, I think he's able to do so much with so little. I can't imagine his budget was huge for this, especially compared to Mimic and Blade 2 and Hellboy. Like this is a pretty modest budget for him, and he's able to pull off so much. And the story is great. Um, the acting is pretty good. Even the kids. I mean, so often child actors are just they're not they're not bad. So often they're just inexperienced. But here you don't get that vibe. Um, they're complex characters who are played very well, and there's a really great backdrop, and he's pulling out so much about humanity and mankind using this sort of war backdrop with this ghostly story at its core. And there's just so much going on, and on a personal level, this movie means quite a bit to me. So I guess I'm going to give it the top Del Toro rating.
I'm going to agree with you. I think this is one of his best films. It's not my personal favorite of his, but I think it's among his best films. And I think this film, even though it was not a huge zeitgeist in pop culture 20 years ago, I mean, we had so many fundamental films that came out that year. I think this film secures him with the back to back with this and Blade 2 being a financial success for him to become a filmmaker free to create his vision of every movie he makes. And I think this is a beautifully well told film that deals with a lot of personal things for him. And I think that's the one thing I love about genre films is that they're, especially horror films, is that they're able to explore social and political topics, whether it be of the past, and usually they use the past to talk about something going on in the present. But I feel like it's a brilliant way to bring up topics that otherwise people would be like, this feels too preachy or to me. And he uses it brilliantly to weave both elements. And I do think that his Spanish language films tend to be stronger than his American films, with the exception of Shape of Water. I feel like that was like the perfect melding of both of his films finally.
Yeah, I tend to lean more toward his Spanish language films. I'm not quite as keen on The Shape of Water as I know a lot of other people are, but I still think it's a pretty pretty solid achievement.
So are you excited about his two upcoming films he has coming out?
So which ones would those be again?
So he's doing a remake of a 1940s noir called Nightmare Alley
Oh,
that takes
yes.
place at a carnival.
Right. I have not seen that film yet. I think it was just recently added to the Criterion Collection, the original, I mean.
Yeah, it
And
was.
yeah, and I haven't seen either the original yet, and of course I haven't seen the Del Toro because it's not out yet. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I like the cast. It's got Kate Blanchett and Rooney Mara reuniting from Carol and all that, and the stills that I've seen online look really striking. So I'm really excited for that one.
And then he's doing an adaptation of Pinocchio that's going to Netflix.
Oh, is that actually happening now? Because I think that's been
Yeah.
in development for years. I didn't know if it
I
was
mean,
actually happening.
it's actually happening. I mean, I know with anything Del Toro's name is attached to, you don't know if it's actually happening because he's been attached to so many different projects that haven't happened or seen the light of day. I mean, I guess we're never going to get at the Mountain of Madness, which I thought that he would finally try to do that with again after winning the Oscar. But I guess maybe it's that hurt too much to try and go back to.
Yeah, I really look forward to him being able to make that happen someday. But it seems like every year that goes by without it, it seems like it's slipping further and further away from actually coming to life.
And I mean, if he knows that maybe it's too close to him now, because for example, Terry Gilliam finally got The Man Who Killed Don Quixote made.
Mm.
And the final product is less interesting to me than what the documentary that came out 20 years ago when he first attempted to make it.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny how that happens. How a director can have a passion project in the works for years, perhaps decades, and then when they finally get to do it, it all just kind of falls apart. It's really sad in a way, and I wouldn't want that to happen to Del Toro.
No, because I think he has a pretty solid filmography thus far. Like we talked about in his Mimic episode, I'm like, if this is his worst movie, then you should consider yourself lucky as a filmmaker, like because it's
Yeah,
not that bad of a movie.
yeah. 'Cause I don't consider Mimic to be his best either by any means, and yet I still find it to be an enjoyable action horror monster movie from the '90s.
Exactly. And then I would like for him, I know Criterion has kind of put Kronos in there with it as a trilogy, even though Kronos does not deal with the Spanish Civil War. It's a more modern day film.
Mm-hmm.
I would love for him to do a third film of whatever genre he wanted to tackle, even if it was, as you said, like just a straightforward film about the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
That would be interesting. I don't know if this is true, but I know at one point I heard rumors of him doing a movie about a little girl surviving like the end of the world and
Oh,
her being like the only person left or something that was going to be like a fantasy film. I don't know if that's
okay.
true or someone just rumored that, but that would be interesting concept too. But I would like for him to do like a third film that takes place in this time period.
Yeah, I don't know much about that story, but I definitely would love him to revisit this territory.
It seems to work well for him. I mean, this and Pan's Labyrinth are probably amongst his best films.
Mm.
At one point, he said this was his favorite film. I don't know if that's still the truth, but at
It,
one time he said this was his favorite film of his.
yeah, I would imagine it's probably his most personal, probably even still to this day.
Well, probably not just for his personal life, but his professional life too. What it meant so
Oh
much
yeah,
to him to get this made. Well,
yeah.
Brandon, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time and your expertise on this. I know you can be a busy person and you have a lot of experience in film.
Yeah, a
So
little bit.
so I appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk about this movie. And you're always welcome back for any other directors we decide to cover in the future if you want to.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I look forward to hearing who your next directors are.
But if someone wanted to find you on social media or you want to plug anything, where could they find you and what are you doing?
So I'm on Twitter at Brandon Stanwyck. I'm also on Letterboxd, and I have a podcast called Academy Queens that I do with a co-host, where we look back at the Oscar categories of years past, mostly the acting ones. We go through all the nominees, talk about what we like and don't like, and then we rank the nominees from least favorite to most favorite. We're currently in between seasons right now, but we're going to be recording the new season, hopefully starting by the end of the month, and that should be out soon. So that's pretty much what I've got going on.
Oh, that's really cool. So you're a big Academy Award kind of nerd.
Well, I'm more of like a film history kind of person. My co-host is more into like the current stuff and all of like the gossip and the precursors and all the other award shows and the formulas that go into winning the Oscars. And I'm more so just a general movie and acting connoisseur who looks at it through that perspective. I'm more removed from the Oscar stuff than he is, so we balance each other out pretty well in that way.
So have you ever like talked about like past awards and talk about how a certain film maybe at the time was considered good, but now like looking back like, well, these movies are now considered masterpieces that either the Academy didn't give an award to or just largely ignored.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny how often sometimes people I think will look back on an Oscar year and think, well, how did this film not win Best Picture? Or how did this person who clearly gave the better performance lose? But so often you have to look at it in the context of its time and what was going on politically in the world, in the country, and in Hollywood that led people to vote a certain way. They may not have even liked the winner themselves, but there was something about it that got their vote. And there's a historical component to a lot of this that I think sometimes gets lost um, online these days. So yeah, that happens all the time.
Yeah, and I think particularly with a lot of actors who end up winning, a lot of times they end up winning an Oscar is more of like a lifetime achievement award than that actual performance. It's like, well, it's their time. They haven't won one.
Yeah, that happens often. Sometimes it's for a performance that is worthy of an award. Sometimes not so much.
Well, that's very interesting, and I'm not going to take up more of your time to ask you more questions about that podcast. I'll just be on the lookout for it because that's a really interesting topic, and I think it's worth discussing because sometimes films that weren't quite well received sometimes turn out being great films, and other times films that were extremely popular at the moment have lost the sands of time.
Yeah, some age better than others. Films as a whole and performances.
For sure. And then, I mean, that's another thing with watching movies. We talk about like not only watching things that terrible people were involved in, but sometimes when you see things in certain films, you've got to be like, well, I got to look at it at the context of when it was released. And yeah, that's not cool now, but maybe back then that was accepted.
Yeah, yeah, times definitely change, and going through the Oscars, sort of more or less in order, you can kind of see that evolution of cultural awareness.
Yeah, and I hope it continues to get better. There are still issues with the Academy. There will always be issues with the Academy because judging art is just silly to begin
Mm-hmm.
with. But
Yep.
I think they try to get better, but then they tend to shoot themselves in the foot. And then, yeah, I mean, it's just going to be a constant thing.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on the show and talking about this movie with me. I look forward to you coming back whenever you want and enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
I'm glad it was and I appreciate it. Thank you.